Hello guys, Mr. B here. What is up? Welcome to a brand new economics video. Today we're going to be looking at our second lesson on labour market economics, which is the market demand curve for labour. So by the end of this topic, you should be able to understand the factors that affect demand for labour, so the factors that will shift the demand curve for labour. And you should also be able to appreciate the significance of elasticity of demand for labour, as well as looking at the factors that affect the elasticity of demand for labour. So here we have a market demand curve for labour. We're going to take the example of car assembly line workers. So on the y-axis, as ever with labour market economics, we have the wage rate. And on the x-axis, we have employment. Sometimes we label that the quantity of labour or quantity of labour employed. Employment is equally fine. We can put that on our x-axis. Now, the good news is that there is quite a complicated way of deriving the market demand curve for labour from the individual firm's MRP, which we looked at last lesson. Luckily, you don't have to understand that. You only need to know how to draw the market demand curve for labour. You don't actually need to understand how it's derived from the MRP. So the good news is that it looks exactly the same as any demand curve that we've seen before when we've been looking at the goods markets. So in this case, if the wage rate paid is W1, then the quantity of labour employed is E1. And if, for example, the wage rate rises to W2, then we would expect that we would get a contraction in demand for labour. So the wage rate rises from W1 to W2. The quantity of labour employed would fall from E1 to E2. And the reverse is also true. If the wage rate fell from W2 to W1, the quantity of labour employed would rise from E2 to E1. And the reasoning for this is given on the left-hand side of the slide here. So we're assuming that the car assembly line business or the car business is a profit maximizing business. So if we get a rise in the wage rate, that raises the cost of production for the car firm. And if the car firm is assumed to be a profit maximizer, then a profit maximizing firm will reduce the quantity demanded of labor if the cost of production goes up. Ceteris paribus, all other things being equal. What you've got to get your head around with labour market economics is that when we've been looking at goods markets in the past, when we've been applying demand and supply to the goods market, the demand has been the consumers or the individuals, and the supply has been producers, often businesses. With labour market economics, it is the other way around. That's what you've got to get your head around. So it's businesses that demand workers. So the employer here is on the demand side, and we'll see later in later lessons that it's actually individuals that supply labour. So the labour market, in a sense, works the other way around to the goods market. So it's the employers or the businesses that demand labour, and as we'll see later, it's the employees or the individuals that supply labour. Now, if there is a change in the wage rate, as we've seen, you will get a movement along the labour demand curve. But if there is a change in any other factor that affects the demand curve for labour, this will cause the demand curve for labour to shift. So what I'd like you to think about is what factors would cause a shift to the right in demand for labour in a car firm or for car assembly line workers. So what factors would cause a rightward shift or a rise in demand for car assembly line workers? You might want to pause the video at this point, have a think about what you think might cause a rise in demand for labour, and we'll see the answers in just a moment. So one factor could be a rise in demand for cars. So you may already be familiar with the term derived demand. So the demand for labour is derived from the demand for cars. Labour is not demanded for its own sake. It's demanded for the goods and services that it is required to produce. So a business will only demand car assembly line workers if households or consumers demand cars. So if there's a rise in demand for cars, there will be a rise in demand for car assembly line workers because labour is a derived demand. Second factor is productivity. So we saw in our previous lesson that if there is a rise in productivity of individual workers, then the MRP curve will shift to the right. So students often get a bit confused on this. They often say, well, hang on a minute, if workers are more productive, surely you don't need as many of them to make the same number of cars. And this is not actually correct. Okay, so if we go back to our MRP lesson, remember that the marginal revenue product, which is the demand curve for labour, equals the marginal physical product of labour multiplied by the price. So assuming a constant price, if the marginal physical product or productivity of workers goes up, that will actually cause a rise in demand for car assembly line workers, not a fall. Okay, so you've got to get that into your heads. A rise in productivity will cause a rise in demand for car assembly line workers. If there is a change in the productivity or perhaps the price of substitutes for car assembly line workers, for example, machines, we might be talking perhaps about robots on the car assembly line, then that will shift demand for labour as well. So if maybe robots become cheaper or car manufacturing becomes more automated, that may cause a leftward shift in demand for labour. And so if productivity of machines falls for any reason, or if machines become perhaps unreliable or something like that, then it's possible that demand for car assembly line workers could shift to the right. On the other hand, if there is any development in technology which raises the productivity of existing labour, that could also shift demand for car assembly line workers to the right. Fourthly, a government employment subsidy. So if government intervention makes the employment of workers cheaper, then that will also raise demand for workers. And finally, we've got a fall in national insurance contributions. So you may not be familiar with this term, but national insurance contributions works a little bit like a tax. So employees and employers both pay national insurance contributions. So businesses will pay national insurance for every worker that they employ. And if the government decides to reduce the rate of national insurance paid by businesses, that effectively acts as a reduction in the tax on employing workers. So it will make employment of workers cheaper. So there's a fall in NICs that will increase demand for car assembly line workers. So now that we've looked at the market demand curve for labour and the shifts in the market demand curve for labour, we need to start looking at the factors that affect the elasticity of demand for labour. So you may be familiar from when we looked at goods markets with the term SPLAT, which is an acronym, actually, an acronym SPLAT, which can help you remember the factors that affect the elasticity of demand for goods in the goods market. And SPLAT stands for substitutes, percentage of income spent on goods, luxury or necessity, addictiveness, and time. Now, what you've got to do is to try and apply that idea of SPLAT to the context of the labour market. And if you can do that, that might be able to help you think about the factors that would affect the elasticity of demand for labour. Technically, the wage elasticity of demand for labour. So the responsiveness of the quantity demanded of labour due to a change in the wage rate. So pause the video, have a think about what factors might affect the elasticity of demand for labour using the acronym SPLAT. So the first thing is the price elasticity of demand for the product itself. So we've talked already about the fact that labour is a derived demand. The demand for car assembly line workers is derived from the demand for cars. This also means that the price elasticity of demand for cars will affect the wage elasticity of demand for labour. So if demand for cars is price inelastic, demand for labour will be price inelastic. Demand for car assembly line workers will be price inelastic. And if demand for cars is elastic, price elastic, then demand for car assembly line workers will be wage elastic. The second one is substitutes. This is the S in SPLAT, of course, substitutes. So the extent to which other factors of production are close substitutes for labor. So it may be that a car manufacturing plant perhaps needs a certain number of workers, or perhaps not. It might depend on how automated they can make the car factory. So if labor is easily substitutable, then demand will be relatively elastic. On the other hand, if you need a certain worker or certain number of workers in your plant, then demand for those workers will be very inelastic. If we move away from the example of car assembly line workers, we might think of an industry like hairdressing, which is very hard to make more automated, more capital intensive. So hairdressing is very labor intensive. And so if there's a rise in the wage rate of hairdressers, then there may not be a significant fall in the quantity of hairdressers employed because it's not very capital intensive. You can't really replace a hairdresser with a robot, not yet anyway. The third one is wage costs as a percentage of total costs. So we sometimes refer to this as labor intensity. So how labor intensive is the industry. So if labor is a large percentage of total costs, if the industry is very labor intensive. So if the industry is very labor intensive, demand will be more elastic. If it's less labor intensive, demand will be more inelastic. And finally, time is an influence which affects elasticity really in all contexts. And as in those other contexts, demand for labor would become more wage elastic in the longer term. So in the longer term, demand becomes more elastic. So just to test your understanding of this second idea here on elasticity of demand for labor, I'd like you to consider the following. So do you think demand for labor would be relatively elastic or relatively inelastic for each of the following cases? And what I'd like you to do in your notes is to write down each of these 7 types of workers, and if you could explain briefly, perhaps in one sentence for each one, whether you think demand for labor would be relatively elastic or relatively inelastic for the following. So for firefighters, you might just say elastic because or inelastic because. So one sentence for each one. Okay, guys, that has been a lesson on labour market demand and elasticity of demand for labour. Hope you enjoyed that and got something out of it. Thank you so much for watching and listening. Leave a like if you enjoyed. Subscribe to the channel if you're new to hear and see plenty more Key Stage 5 economics content. And I'll see you next time.